In the 9th century BC, while the ancient Mediterranean was buzzing with the rising power of Assyria and the fading kingdoms of the Bronze Age, a Phoenician princess named Alyssa made a daring escape from her homeland of Tyre. Known as Dido in the ancient Tales, her story is wrapped in myth and legend, but her journey across the sea sparked the creation of an empire that would eventually challenge Rome itself. Alyssa's flight was fueled by betrayal and bloodshed. Her brother Pygmalion, the king of Tyre, had murdered her husband Cobus for his wealth, forcing her to flee with whatever treasures and loyal followers she could gather. The Phoenicians were already skilled navigators, known for their cedar ships carrying purple dye, glass, and metalwork to every corner of the known world. But Alyssa wasn't on a trading mission. She was on a desperate quest for survival, seeking a new home far from her brother's reach. The group sailed west, passing Cyprus and Rhodes, and the Greek colonies of Sicily, until they finally reached the coast of North Africa. Near what we now call Tunis, Alyssa struck a deal with the local Berber king Yaba for land. The king, perhaps amused by this small band of foreigners, agreed to sell them only as much land as could be covered by an ox hide. But Alyssa was clever. She cut the hide into the thinnest strips and arranged them in a circle, claiming a significant hilltop that would come to be known as Bursa, from the Greek word for oxhide. Whether this tale is fact or fancy is less important than what it symbolizes. From the very start, the Punic city was born out of cunning and desperation, with people willing to risk everything for a shot at something greater. It was around 814 BC, and on that windswept hill overlooking a natural harbor, the greatest maritime empire of the ancient Mediterranean began to take shape. The early settlement was humble wooden buildings clustered around the harbor. Workshops where craftsmen worked bronze and iron, and simple temples where colonists made offerings to their gods. But the location was spot on. The harbor sheltered ships, while the hill provided a defensible position. Most importantly, it sat at the narrowest point of the Mediterranean, where Africa nearly touches Sicily. Any ship traveling between the eastern and western parts of the ancient sea would pass right by this North African hub. Within a few decades, that strategic spot started paying off. Phoenician merchants from Tyre and Sidon saw the potential of this new outpost and began using it as a base for their ventures in the west. Ships arrived carrying cedarwood and purple dye from Lebanon, metalwork from Cyprus, and precious goods from far-off lands. They left loaded with silver from Spain, tin from distant Britain, and ivory from Africa. The Punic settlers quickly became more than just middlemen. They set up their own trading posts along the Spanish coast, especially around the silver-rich region of Tartessos. They even sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and ventured into the Atlantic to trade with the mysterious peoples of the north. Some scholars believe their ships may have reached the British Isles and even the West African coast, navigating currents and winds that wouldn't be rediscovered by Europeans for over 1,000 years. As wealth flowed into the city, it began to develop a character that would define it for centuries. This wasn't a conquest state like Assyria or Egypt, built on military domination and tribute. Instead, the Punic city was something fresh, a commercial empire held together by trade agreements, mutual benefit, and the simple fact that its merchants could reach places others couldn't. Its power lay not in massive armies, but in its ability to connect distant markets and profit from the exchange. The political system that emerged reflected this commercial nature. The Phoenician colony was run by merchant aristocrats, families whose wealth came from trade rather than land. At the top stood two annually elected magistrates called suffetes, similar to Latin consuls. Below them was a council of elders and a larger assembly of citizens, though real power remained in the hands of the wealthiest families. It was an oligarchy, but one based on commercial success instead of military conquest. The religious life of early Punic civilization revolved around deities inherited from their Phoenician homeland. Chief among these was Tanit, the goddess of fertility and the moon, whose symbol, a triangle topped by a horizontal line and circle, would become as recognizable as the city itself. Alongside her was Baal-Hamon, the lord of the burning flame, a god of sky and weather, whose worship raised eyebrows among Greek and Roman observers. These deities were housed in temples that grew more elaborate as the city's wealth increased, filled with the smoke of incense and the rhythm of ritual drums. But it was on the water that Carthage truly showcased its spirit. The city's harbor was split into two sections and rectangular, commercial port for merchant vessels, and a perfectly round military harbor that could shelter over 200 warships. This naval harbor was a marvel of engineering, with a circular island in the center, serving as the admiral's headquarters, surrounded by ship sheds arranged like the spokes of a wheel. From the sea, the military harbor was nearly invisible, hidden behind the commercial port and accessible only through a narrow channel that could be easily defended. The ships reflected Carthaginian priorities. Their merchant vessels were broad and deep, designed to carry maximum cargo rather than win races. But their warships were among the finest in the Mediterranean. Galleys, powered by multiple banks of oars and armed with bronze rams for sinking enemy vessels, were manned by crews trained in innovative naval tactics. They even practiced breaking enemy ore banks by ramming them at an angle, a technique that required exceptional seamanship and would serve them well in the battles to come. As the 6th century BC wrapped up, Carthage was about to face its first big challenge. Greek colonists, moving west from their homeland, had set up thriving cities in Sicily and southern Italy. These Greek settlements were eyeing the same trade routes that had fueled Carthaginian success, and you just knew conflict was on the horizon. The fight for Sicily would take up a lot of Carthage's energy for centuries, but it would also help them grow into a real military powerhouse. But this transformation wasn't a walk in the park. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, Carthaginians didn't see war as something to celebrate. They were primarily merchants and sailors, stepping into the role of soldiers only when absolutely necessary. And let me tell you, necessity can be a tough teacher. Early losses taught them that having a professional army was crucial. They started bringing in mercenaries from all over the Mediterranean like Iberian swordsmen, Balearic slingers, and Numidian cavalry from North Africa. These hired guns fought under Carthaginian leaders, driven by contracts rather than loyalty, but often turned out to be more dependable than local militias. The military system that came out of these conflicts was pretty unique for its time. At the heart of it were a small number of Carthaginian citizens, often serving as officers or in elite units like the Sacred Band, which was made up of noble sons who fought with everything they had to prove their worth. But most of the army was made up of mercenaries, professional soldiers who fought for pay and a chance to grab some loot. This setup had its perks. Carthaginian casualties stayed low, and they could tap into the special skills of warriors from various lands. But it also created some dependencies and weaknesses that would cost them down the line. Meanwhile, just across the narrow sea from Africa, another power was starting to stir. Rome, which was still a modest city-state by the Tiber River, was gearing up for its own rise to dominance over the Italian peninsula. In 509 BC, which is considered the founding year of the Roman Republic, Rome and Carthage signed their first treaty. It was a pretty basic agreement, outlining each other's spheres of influence and promising to respect each other's trading rights. At that point, neither side could have imagined that this diplomatic gesture would kick off a struggle that would lead to one city's complete destruction. This treaty showed how both powers viewed themselves back then. Rome was still a regional player, mostly focused on its immediate neighbors in central Italy. Carthage, on the other hand, was already thinking big, claiming authority over much of North Africa and asserting special rights in Sicily and Sardinia. The treaty kind of reads like a nod between unequal partners, with Rome promising not to mess with Carthaginian interests in exchange for trading privileges in their ports. But Rome was on the rise. With each decade, Roman legions pushed their control further down the Italian peninsula, taking over or absorbing the Greek cities in the south, the Etruscan city-states in the north, and the tribal groups in the central mountains. They were getting the hang of warfare and diplomacy, building a military system that would eventually conquer the known world. Most importantly, they were developing a unique Roman knack for organization, the ability to bring defeated enemies on board as allies and turn conquest into lasting political unity. On the flip side, Carthage was reaching the natural limits of its commercial empire. By the 4th century BC, Carthaginian ships were trading in every port of the western Mediterranean. Their colonies were spread across the coasts of Spain and North Africa, and their wealth was legendary. The city itself was stunning, with gleaming white walls under the African sun and harbors filled with ships from all over. Visitors were blown away by the grandeur of its temples, the skill of its craftsmen, and the lively markets where you could hear a dozen languages mingling with the calls of merchants and the sounds of sacrificial animals. But beneath all that prosperity were some cracks that could lead to future trouble. Carthage's empire was held together more by mutual interest than by loyalty. Its armies were mostly made up of mercenaries who could easily switch sides if their pay was late or if victory seemed uncertain. Plus, their political system, dominated by wealthy families, sometimes struggled to make quick decisions in crisis. Most importantly, Carthage was a maritime power at a time when the future belonged to those who could control land as well as sea. Their religious practices were also starting to attract criticism from Greek and Roman observers. The worship of Moloch, though scholars still debate whether this was a god or just a type of sacrifice, involved burning children in times of crisis, with their remains buried in sacred places called tophets. This practice horrified Greek and Roman sensibilities and would later become handy propaganda for Carthage's enemies. Whether it was genuine religious devotion or desperate attempts to appease angry gods during military disasters is still up for debate. As the 4th century BCE came to a close, Carthage was at the peak of its early power. Its ships ruled the western Mediterranean. Its colonies stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Greek territory, and its wealth was unmatched outside the great kingdoms of the East. The city had survived Greek challenges in Sicily, weathered internal political strife, and emerged stronger from each test. But the biggest challenge was still lurking across the narrow sea. Rome was finishing up its conquest of Italy and setting its sights on Sicily. The island, which had been a battleground between Carthaginians and Greeks for centuries, was about to become the prize in a much bigger game. The two greatest powers of the western Mediterranean supposed allies, but real rivals, were about to find out that the world wasn't big enough for both their ambitions. The stage was set for a conflict that would change the ancient world forever. A showdown between two fundamentally different visions of empire. Rome, with its citizen soldiers and territorial conquests, represented the land-based power of the future. Carthage, with its merchant princes and maritime empire, embodied the commercial civilization of the past. The real question wasn't if they would clash, but which vision would survive the storm that was coming. By the 6th century BC, the Phoenician colony had transformed from a desperate refuge into the bustling heart of a maritime empire that spread across the western Mediterranean like a web of trade and influence. What started as a few scattered trading posts and temporary harbors evolved into a network of colonies, protectorates, and client states that recognized the supremacy of the harbor city. This expansion wasn't just about conquest. It was all about smart business moves. Each new settlement had a role in the bigger picture. Utica and Hadrumetum secured the coastal routes, while Levitha and New Carthage controlled access to the rich Iberian silver mines. The Balearic Islands became famous for their skilled slingers, whose bronze bullets could punch through armor from impressive distances. Sardinia and Corsica offered strategic bases and agricultural bounty, with their mountainous interiors providing timber for the ever-growing fleet. But it was in Iberia where Carthaginian ambitions truly shone. The peninsula was legendary for its mineral wealth: silver from Tartessus, copper from the southern mountains, and iron from the north. Phoenician traders had been tapping into these resources for generations, but now North Africa was establishing a more permanent presence. Gades, known today as Cadiz, became the western anchor of their empire, featuring a massive temple to Melkart that served as both a religious hub and a fortress controlling the Atlantic approaches. The wealth flowing from these ventures was jaw-dropping. Ancient sources talk about silver mines so rich that even the anchors of ships were made from precious metal, while lead ingots stamped with Carthaginian seals have been found all over the maritime world. The city's merchants were savvy, developing banking practices that extended credit across vast distances and managed complex transactions involving multiple ports and currencies. Letters of credit issued in North Africa could be honored as far away as the Atlantic coast of Morocco or the Tin Islands in the far north. This booming commercial empire needed a new way to govern itself, and the oligarchy proved to be surprisingly flexible. Instead of imposing direct control over distant territories, they crafted a system of treaties and alliances that respected local autonomy while securing exclusive trading rights. Client kings ruled in their traditional ways, but their foreign relations were guided by Carthage. Tribute came in many forms: precious metals, agricultural goods, exotic animals for arena games, and most importantly, manpower for the armies that protected this sprawling network. The political structure that emerged was unique for its time. The Safites were the nominal heads of state, but real power rested with the Council of Elders and the mysterious tribunal known as the 104. This group, made up of the wealthiest families, acted as both the Supreme Court and the board of directors for what was essentially a commercial state. They reviewed generals' performances, approved major trading ventures, and made the life-and-death decisions that shaped policies across 2 continents. The 104 were feared throughout the Carthaginian realm. Generals who failed in their campaigns faced dire consequences, while those who succeeded too well risked exile for threatening the oligarchy's grip on power. This system led to cautious yet competent leadership, but it also fostered factionalism that would later become a significant issue. The merchant elite were united in their quest for profit, but divided in how to achieve it. Naval technology reached new heights thanks to their innovations. The circular harbor could shelter over 200 warships, each one a marvel of maritime engineering. The standard trireme carried 170 rowers arranged in 3 banks, with bronze rams that could smash through enemy hulls with devastating force. But they didn't stop there. They developed quadriremes, and even larger vessels equipped with catapults, turning them into floating fortresses. More importantly, they perfected naval warfare itself. Carthaginian admirals devised tactics that leveraged their superior seamanship, including the famous periplus maneuver, allowing a skilled captain to circle behind enemy formations and ram them from unexpected angles. Their navigators could find their way using only the stars and currents, sailing in weather conditions that kept other fleets stuck in port. The sacred texts guiding these voyages were closely guarded secrets, passed down through families of master mariners who formed a hereditary caste within their society. However, this success also brought new challenges. As the 6th century rolled on, Hellenic colonists began pushing westward with increasing boldness, setting up prosperous settlements in Sicily and southern Italy. These newcomers eyed the same trade routes that fueled Carthaginian prosperity, bringing with them a different vision of Empire I based on territorial control rather than commercial networks. The clash was bound to happen, and Sicily became the epicenter. Its central location in the Mediterranean made it strategically crucial, while its fertile plains and thriving cities offered rich rewards for any power that could seize control. The eastern half was already dominated by Hellenic settlements like Syracuse and Agrigentum, which were as wealthy as the mother cities. The western part, however, still had a Phoenician influence, anchored by strongholds like Mattia and Panormus. The first serious confrontation came in 480 BC, when a massive expedition crossed from Africa with the goal of breaking Greek power once and for all. This force was led by Hamilcar, the first of that name to gain prominence in their history, and it represented the largest military effort the maritime hub had ever undertaken. Contemporary sources claim there were 300,000 men involved, though that number is likely exaggerated. What's undeniable is the scale of the disaster that followed. At Himera, on the northern coast, Hamilcar's army clashed with the combined forces of Syracuse and Agrigentum in a battle that would change the balance of power in the western Mediterranean. The details are murky, shrouded in the biased accounts of later historians, but the outcome was clear. The expedition was decimated. Hamilcar himself perished in the flames of his own camp, and North African dreams of dominance went up in smoke with him. The defeat at Himera imparted harsh lessons that the leadership wouldn't forget. Relying solely on hired soldiers, no matter how many, couldn't match the motivated resistance of settlers fighting for their homes. The complex logistics of maintaining large armies across water made ambitious campaigns extremely vulnerable to disruption. Most importantly, the city-state militias of the Hellenic settlements, fighting on familiar turf with local support, had advantages that no amount of wealth could easily overcome. The response was pretty practical, right? Instead of rushing into revenge, Carthage decided to take a step back, focus on what they already had, and build up their strength. Sure, the defeat hit hard in terms of both lives lost and their reputation, but the backbone of their trade network was still standing strong. Silver kept pouring in from the mines in Iberia. Fresh agricultural goods flowed in from Sardinia, and their bustling harbor was still a hotspot for merchants from all over the region. More importantly, this setback sparked a big change in how they approached warfare. The old ways of gathering tribal fighters and hiring Greek mercenaries just weren't cutting it anymore. They started to get serious about professionalizing their military. Officers began to study the tactics that had beaten them, adapting those Greek phalanx formations to fit their North African troops. They also got smarter about recruitment, looking for specific skills instead of just numbers, like those legendary Balearic slingers known for their accuracy, the agile Numidian horsemen who could outmaneuver heavy infantry, and the fierce Iberian swordsmen whose blades were feared across the seas. Then there were the religious vibes after Himera, which were just as intense. The defeat was seen as a sign that the gods were not happy, leading to a surge in rituals that would later shock outsiders. The Tophet, where children were sacrificed to Moloch in desperate times, saw a lot more action as families tried to win back the favor of the gods. These burnt offerings, with their remains carefully buried in special urns, became more common during crises, leaving behind an archaeological record that still gives modern excavators the chills. But the harbor city showed some serious resilience. By the middle of the 5th century, they were back in action in Sicily, this time with a more cautious game plan. Instead of chasing after big battles, they focused on shoring up their existing bases and slowly expanding their influence through smart diplomacy and economic pressure. The fortress of Matia, on an island off the western coast, became a symbol of this new strategy: strong, well-stocked, and linked to the mainland by a causeway that could be cut off during a siege. During this time, the rivalry with Syracuse really heated up. Both sides were trying to outmaneuver each other without jumping into full-blown war. Syracuse, under the rule of Dionysius I, was busy spreading its influence across the island and into southern Italy, creating its own web of alliances that mirrored what Carthage was doing. They both knew Sicily was way too valuable to let go, but also too big for either to control entirely. This led to a series of limited conflicts, diplomatic back and forths, and shifting alliances that kept the region on edge. Dionysius was a tough opponent, mixing clever military tactics with political savvy. His engineers came up with new siege technologies, like massive catapults that could take down even the sturdiest fortifications. He extended Syracusan influence all the way to the Adriatic and challenged Phoenician naval dominance in waters that had been like a North African lake until then. Most dangerously, he knew how to exploit Carthaginian weaknesses, playing on the cultural divides within their diverse armies and the political strife in their oligarchic system. The struggle peaked during the siege of Matia. In 397 BC, Dionysius had spent years gearing up for this attack, building the largest siege train the Western Mediterranean had ever seen. When the assault finally happened, it wasn't just a test of engineering. It was a showdown of two competing visions of power. Could Carthage's fortified bases and hired soldiers hold up against the focused attack of a united city-state? The answer was a harsh reality check. Despite some heroic resistance, Matia fell after a siege that showcased the changing landscape of warfare. The old reliance on naval strength and trade leverage wasn't enough against enemies who had both the tech and the determination to take down seemingly unassailable positions. The fall of Matia sent shockwaves throughout the empire, shaking the very foundations of their long-standing strategies. Even in defeat, though, Carthage showed its adaptability, which had been key to building their empire. Instead of trying to rebuild Matia, they set up a new base at Lilybaeum, designed from the ground up to withstand the kind of assault that had taken down its predecessor. They recruited fresh armies, struck new deals with local tribes, and braced themselves for the long fight that seemed unavoidable. As the 4th century rolled on, Warfare settled into a rhythm of advance and retreat, victories and losses that drained both sides without giving a clear winner. Each campaign brought new ideas, different weapons, tactics, and alliances, but the overall balance stayed pretty much the same. The Hellenic settlements controlled the east, while Carthaginian strongholds anchored the west, leaving the center as a battleground where neither side could claim lasting control. This ongoing conflict was changing both civilizations. Syracuse was becoming more militaristic, with its democracy giving way to tyrants promising victory at any cost. Meanwhile, Carthage was learning the tough lessons of prolonged warfare, developing the strategies and institutions that would eventually challenge the rising power of Rome. Neither city could have guessed that their rivalry was just the opening act of a much larger drama that would reshape the ancient world. By the dawn of the 3rd century BC, the Carthaginian Empire had reached a stable point that masked some serious internal tensions. Their trade networks were still profitable, their naval bases stronger than ever, and their armed forces adapting to new realities. But the easy wins of earlier expansions were a thing of the past, replaced by the tough demands of defending distant territories against increasingly savvy foes. And on the horizon, a new power was rising across the narrow waters between Africa and Europe. The Latin Republic was finishing up its conquest of Italy, absorbing or wiping out every rival from the Alps down to the toe of the peninsula. Before long, the two biggest powers in the Western Mediterranean would find themselves face to face, with Sicily once again at stake as the prize that would determine the fate of empires. While the harbor cities' galleys ruled the western waters, and Phoenician merchants counted their silver in Africa, something pretty different was brewing on the Italian peninsula. The city on the Tiber started as just a bunch of hilltop villages, but by the 4th century BC, it had morphed into something totally new, a republic that didn't just trade or sail the seas, but gobbled up its neighbors through a relentless mix of conquest, alliances, and assimilation. Roman expansion was a mix of strategy and sheer force. Unlike the Carthaginians, who set up trading posts and made deals with local rulers, the Romans absorbed entire peoples into their growing federation. Defeated enemies became allies, their warriors marched under Roman standards, and their gods found a place in the ever-expanding Roman pantheon. This wasn't just empire building in the usual sense. It was something fresh, a political beast that got stronger with every conquest rather than breaking apart. By the early 3rd century, this unstoppable march had brought the Italian Republic right up to the doorstep of Punic interests. The heel and toe of the peninsula were firmly under Roman control, while the great harbor cities in the south, Tarentum, Rhegium, Neapolis, were either conquered or scared into submission. And for the North African power, the most alarming part was that Roman eyes were now fixed on Sicily, that lush prize sitting just across the narrow strait. The spark that ignited the first major conflict between these rival civilizations came from an unexpected source, a group of Italian mercenaries known as the Mamertines, or Sons of Mars. These fortune-seekers had taken over the prosperous city of Messana, controlling the vital strait between the mainland and Sicily. When Syracuse tried to kick them out, the desperate mercenaries made a fateful choice. They asked both Carthage and Rome for help at the same time. The Phoenicians were quick to respond, sending their ships across from their bases on the western coast. A Carthaginian garrison took over Messana's citadel, and it looked like the crisis would be settled in the usual way through negotiation, bribery, and the careful balancing of interests that had kept the western waters relatively peaceful for ages. The merchants of the harbor city could go back to their business, confident that their maritime supremacy was safe. But the senators in Rome saw things differently. For them, Punic control of Messana was an unacceptable threat to their newfound dominance in southern Italy. If the Phoenicians could garrison cities just across the water, what was stopping them from stirring up trouble among the recently conquered Greek settlements? The Senate debate was intense, with traditionalists arguing that crossing the strait would break ancient agreements and drag the Republic into conflicts far from home. When the decision finally came, it showed the big difference between the two powers. While Carthaginian policy was driven by merchant princes calculating profit and loss, Roman choices came from a citizen assembly that valued honor over commercial gain. The vote was tight, but those pushing for action won out. Consul Appius Claudius would lead 2 legions across the strait, marking the start of serious challenges to Phoenician supremacy. The initial crossing was a bold move. Claudius secretly negotiated with the Mamertines still inside Messana, promising them better terms than what their current protectors offered. When his forces approached under the cover of night, the mercenaries opened the gates and kicked out the Carthaginian garrison. By dawn, Roman eagles were flying over the citadel, and the stage was set for a struggle that would change the ancient world. The Carthaginian response was swift but predictable. Admiral Hanno brought a powerful fleet to reclaim Messana, while land forces under Hiero of Syracuse prepared to besiege the new invaders. It should have been straightforward. The Roman legions had no experience with maritime operations, no galleys to speak of, and no way to supply themselves across hostile waters. The merchants of the harbor city expected a quick campaign that would restore the traditional balance and teach the land-bound Latins the folly of challenging those who ruled the sea. Instead, they found that their enemies had something far more dangerous than ships or silver, an absolute refusal to accept defeat. When Claudius found himself trapped in Messana with dwindling supplies, he didn't negotiate or retreat. Instead, he launched daring attacks against both the Phoenician fleet and the Syracusan army, using the superior discipline and equipment of his legions to achieve victories that seemed impossible given the situation. The capture of Syracuse itself sent shockwaves through the Punic establishment. Hiero, faced with the choice between destruction and survival, chose the latter and brought his considerable forces over to the Roman side. Within months, the invaders had gone from isolated raiders to the dominant power on the eastern half of Sicily. Their supply lines were secured by new allies, and their confidence soared thanks to victories against supposedly superior enemies. The conflicts that followed would last 23 years and transform both civilizations in ways neither could have predicted. For the North African power, it meant moving away from comfortable commercial competition and proxy conflicts toward a full-on struggle against an enemy that didn't seem to know when it was beaten. For the Italian Republic, it meant learning to fight at sea against masters who had ruled those waters for centuries. The early campaigns highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of both systems. Carthaginian armies were professional, well-equipped, and led by experienced officers who understood the complexities of combined operations. Their fleets were impressive, their tactics sophisticated, and their ability to move forces by sea gave them a strategic edge that land-bound enemies couldn't match. But their soldiers fought for pay, not patriotism, and their commanders faced political interference from merchant oligarchs who were more about profit than strategy. Their empire was held together by mutual interest rather than a shared identity. On the flip side, Roman forces were citizen soldiers fighting for their homes and honor. Their gear was standardized, their discipline legendary, and their willingness to take casualties and keep fighting was almost fanatical. But they were essentially a land army trying to run a maritime campaign, relying on allies for ships and supplies, making them vulnerable to the strategic mobility that Phoenician admirals provided their enemies. The early sea battles were disasters for the Republic. At Lipara, an entire squadron was captured due to superior seamanship, while other encounters saw inexperienced crews outmaneuvered and outgunned by pros. It became clear that traditional tactics, ramming and boarding actions fought by skilled mariners, would never allow a land-based power to compete with centuries of expertise. The solution, when it came, showcased the Roman knack for practical innovation. Unable to match Phoenician seamanship, they decided to turn maritime battles into land battles fought on floating platforms. The corvus, a boarding bridge that could be dropped onto enemy vessels, turned their galleys into mobile fortresses from which legionaries could attack hostile ships using the same tactics that had conquered Italy. The first big test of this new tech came at Mylae, where Consul Gaius Duilius led a Roman fleet against the Carthaginian admiral Hannibal, not the famous general, but an earlier namesake. The Phoenicians approached with confidence, expecting another easy win over inexperienced crews. Instead, they found their superior seamanship neutralized by a forest of boarding bridges that locked their galleys in place, allowing Roman marines to swarm aboard. The victory at Mylae shocked both sides. For the first time in centuries, a Punic squadron had been decisively defeated in open battle. The captured ships were paraded through the streets of Rome, while Duilius became the first commander to celebrate a naval triumph. More importantly, the Republic showed that maritime supremacy wasn't a given. It was a temporary advantage that could be overcome with determination and creativity. The Carthaginian response really showed both the strengths and weaknesses of their system. Instead of just accepting a new balance of power, they threw tons of resources into a counteroffensive aimed at taking the fight straight to Italy. Enter Marcus Atilius Regulus and his expedition, which was a true showcase of what the harbor city could muster over 300 ships, seasoned crews led by experienced admirals, and a plan that aimed to leverage their traditional strengths in mobility and logistics. The Battle of Ignomus, off the southern coast of Sicily, became the biggest naval clash in ancient history. Picture this: nearly 700 galleys battling it out in waters that turned red with blood, while tens of thousands of rowers and marines fought for control of the sea lanes that would ultimately decide the outcome. The Roman squadron, using a wedge formation that had worked wonders for them on land, charged through the middle and snagged a victory that opened the door to Africa. Regulus landed on the North African coast with 15,000 men and immediately began wreaking havoc on the fertile lands that fed Carthage with grain and troops. For a moment, it looked like the hostilities might end with the Phoenicians throwing in the towel, as their armies struggled to match Roman discipline in open combat. Towns surrendered, tribal allies jumped ship, and panic set in among the ruling elite as Roman eagles came into view of their capital's walls. But the merchants had one key advantage that caught everyone off guard: the cash to hire the best talent in the ancient world. The arrival of Xanthippus the Spartan, a pro-soldier trained in the legendary ways of Lacedaemon, changed the game almost overnight. Xanthippus didn't just bring tactical smarts. He knew exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in the Roman approach. The Roman armies were fantastic when fighting on familiar ground with secure supply lines, but they became vulnerable when isolated in enemy territory against foes who knew their limitations. The Spartan revamped the Carthaginian forces, trained them in new formations, and prepared for a showdown that would test whether citizen soldiers could hold their own when stripped of their usual advantages. The Battle of Tunis turned into a masterclass in using combined arms against an enemy that had grown too confident from previous victories. Xanthippus deployed his elephants to break up Roman formations, used his cavalry to disrupt their usual tactical flexibility, and committed his infantry only when the enemy was already shaken and demoralized. Regulus was captured, his army wiped out, and the survivors were rescued by a relief squadron that barely escaped Carthage's resurgent forces. The disaster in Africa forced both sides to rethink their strategies and commit to a longer, tougher struggle than they had expected. For Rome, it meant giving up dreams of a quick victory and settling in for a drawn-out campaign that their political system was uniquely built to handle. For the Phoenicians, it showed that even spectacular defensive victories couldn't fix the problem of an enemy that wouldn't admit defeat. The middle years turned into a monotonous series of raids, sieges, and inconclusive battles that drained both sides' treasuries without delivering decisive outcomes. Punic squadrons controlled the sea, but couldn't stop Roman armies from dominating the land. The Republic's legions could win battles, but couldn't force a peace with enemies, who could always retreat to their fortresses and bases in Africa. Sicily itself became a wasteland, its cities in ruins, and its countryside depopulated from years of relentless fighting. Both civilizations were learning some tough lessons about the costs of total war between evenly matched opponents. The harbor city realized that their mercenary system, no matter how professional, couldn't compete with the sustained commitment of citizen soldiers fighting for their survival. Meanwhile, the merchants' controlling policy found their careful calculations thrown off by commanders who valued honor over profit and enemies willing to go bankrupt rather than accept reasonable terms. The Italian Republic was also figuring out that their knack for absorbing and assimilating defeated foes didn't translate to naval operations against a sophisticated empire. Their fleets, despite some tactical upgrades, remained vulnerable to storms and superior seamanship. More importantly, they were learning that victories on land meant nothing if they couldn't translate that into political control over an enemy whose real strength lay just out of reach. The final phase kicked off when both sides, worn out from years of inconclusive fighting, threw their remaining resources into one last campaign to determine the outcome. The Carthaginian efforts focused on a massive buildup to regain absolute control of the sea and isolate Roman forces on Sicily. The Republic's response was classic. They would build their own fleet, bigger and more powerful than anything they had attempted before, and settle the matter through direct confrontation. The Aegates Islands, off Sicily's western coast, became the stage for this ultimate test of maritime power. Admiral Hanno approached with ships loaded with supplies for the besieged fortress of Lilybaeum, while Roman commander Lucius Catulus waited with over 200 of the latest galleys. What followed wasn't just a clash of fleets. It was a showdown between two different ideas of power itself. The result was a disaster that ended not just the battle, but the entire conflict. Hanno's fleet was wiped out, the supplies that could have sustained further resistance were lost, and Carthage's ability to keep fighting was shattered. Hannibal Barca, the commander in Sicily, found himself with veteran troops, but no way to supply them, facing enemies who could now reinforce at will. The peace talks that followed showed just how much the balance of power had shifted. The terms imposed were tough: evacuate Sicily, pay massive reparations, and accept limits that acknowledged the Republic's new status as a maritime power. More importantly, the fighting had set precedents and created grudges that would shape the relationship between these civilizations for generations. As Hamilcar's veterans boarded their transport ships, leaving territories that Carthage had held for centuries, few could have guessed this was just the first act in a drama that would consume both civilizations. The seeds of future conflict were sown in the blood-soaked soil of Sicily, while in the mountains of Iberia, a young boy named Hannibal was learning to despise everything the Roman eagle stood for. The first struggle was over, but the greater confrontation was still to come. The sting of defeat hit Hannibal Barca hard as his ships limped away from Sicily, carrying the remains of what used to be a mighty force on the western seas. It was a moment that sparked a vow that would echo through time. The first clash with the Italian Republic was done, but the real battle was just beginning. Far away in the mountains of Iberia, Hamilcar was ready to build a new kind of power, not one based on trade and commerce, but fueled by a burning desire for revenge. In the years that followed the peace treaty, the gap between the victors and the vanquished became painfully clear. The folks in Rome were throwing grand celebrations, building impressive temples, and showing off captured ships as trophies in the Forum. Their confidence was soaring, thanks to the silver flowing in from across the sea, which funded new roads, aqueducts, and their ever-growing military ambitions. For the first time, the Roman eagles were ruling the waves, and it felt like the world was shrinking in front of them. Meanwhile, the city back home was reeling from disaster and political chaos. The hefty fines from the treaty drained the treasury, and losing Sicily shattered the trade networks that had kept the city thriving for ages. To make matters worse, the mercenaries who had fought bravely now demanded payment that the empty treasury simply couldn't provide. This set the stage for a rebellion that would make the previous defeat look like a walk in the park. It all kicked off in the spring after the evacuation, when African and Iberian soldiers camped outside the city walls realized their leaders couldn't pay them. What began as a protest over unpaid wages quickly spiraled into a full-blown social revolution, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of Carthaginian society. The rebels found allies in oppressed Libyan farmers, exploited mine workers, and tribal leaders who had long been unhappy under Tyrian rule. For 3 years, the port city fought for its survival against enemies who knew its weaknesses inside and out. The rebels controlled the countryside, cutting off food supplies and rallying support from the dispossessed people of North Africa. They had the inside scoop on the city's defenses, understood the political rifts within the ruling class, and fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left to lose. At times, the besiegers got so close that smoke from their campfires was visible from the city walls. Hamilcar emerged from this chaos a changed man. The businessman who had sailed to Sicily transformed into a soldier politician who realized that being a tactical genius meant nothing without the political savvy to back it up. He crushed the rebellion with a mix of battlefield brilliance and ruthless strategy, pitting his enemies against each other and exploiting their divisions. But he learned that the old ways of the harbor city wouldn't cut it for the challenges ahead. While the oligarchs celebrated restoring order and returned to their counting houses, Hamilcar was already plotting the next phase of the epic showdown. The peace treaty forbade direct revenge against the Republic, but it didn't say anything about expanding into Iberia. The region was rich in minerals that could fund new armies. Its warrior tribes could become loyal soldiers, and its mountains could serve as training grounds for a new generation of officers who would learn to despise everything the Roman eagle stood for. Crossing into Iberia marked the start of a fresh chapter in North African history. Hamilcar didn't just bring soldiers and administrators. He also brought his family, including a 9-year-old boy named Hannibal, who would soon make a vow that would change the ancient world forever. At a blood-soaked altar in the mountains, with sacred fires burning and priests chanting in the old language, the boy placed his hand on the sacrifice and pledged eternal hatred for the Republic. It was a dramatic moment, but also the birth of a legend that would haunt Roman nightmares for generations to come. The reconquest of Iberia unfolded with impressive efficiency. Unlike the scattered trading posts of the past, Hamilcar built a territorial empire based on direct control and occupation. Silver funded professional armies, while tribal recruits learned discipline and tactics. New cities sprang up where there were once just trading posts, and their walls were designed not for trade, but for defense against sieges. Most importantly, a new generation of officers emerged from these campaigns' men, who understood that the next battle wouldn't be about profit, but about survival. Hasdrubal, Hamilcar's son-in-law and successor, brought a touch of diplomatic finesse to the operation. While Hamilcar had relied mainly on conquest, Hasdrubal skillfully negotiated treaties and marriage alliances to extend their influence peacefully. His biggest win was the Ebro Treaty with the Republic, which recognized the river as the boundary between their territories. It seemed like a promise of peace, but it also gave the port city a green light to expand south of that line. But behind the diplomatic smiles, preparations for the ultimate showdown were already in motion. Workshops cranked out weapons and armor using standardized designs, while training camps in the mountains turned recruits from various tribes into a united force. The famous mixed arms system reached new heights, blending the speed of Numidian cavalry with the resilience of Iberian infantry and the shock power of African elephants. The political scene in the harbor city was changing in some pretty significant ways that would set the stage for an epic showdown. After a rough defeat, the old commercial leaders lost their credibility, while Hamilcar's crew, the Barcids, rose to power like never before. This wasn't just a simple reshuffle. It was a complete overhaul of how power worked. The merchant oligarchy found themselves leaning more on military commanders who were loyal to family honor instead of just business interests. Young Hannibal grew up in this new environment. Unlike his dad, who learned the ropes of generalship the hard way, Hannibal was groomed from childhood to be a force of vengeance. He was fluent in Latin, studied Roman tactics and history, and learned to think like his enemies while holding on to a fierce hatred for everything they stood for. By the time he hit 20, he was already seen as the most promising officer in Iberia, blending his dad's strategic smarts with a tactical flair that felt almost magical. The spark that kicked off the second major conflict came from an unexpected place, a small town called Saguntum. Nestled south of the Ebro, this town had ties to the Republic that stretched back a century. When local political squabbles turned violent, both sides called on their patrons, creating a proxy war that echoed the earlier fight over Sicily. Roman ambassadors showed up in New Carthage, demanding that Hannibal respect Saguntum's independence. The young general, now the top dog after Hasdrubal's assassination, greeted them with all the politeness due to honored guests, but with the disdain reserved for those he saw as enemies. The meeting was short and to the point. Saguntum was in Carthage's territory, as per their treaty, and its internal matters were none of the Republic's business. Case closed. What followed was both a military campaign and a bold diplomatic move. Hannibal's engineers used the best techniques available, and his army showed off the impressive teamwork that years of training had instilled. But the real audience wasn't just the defenders of Saguntu. It was all the Mediterranean powers watching. After 8 months of top-notch siege work, the town fell, its people enslaved, and its riches added to Carthage's coffers. The Republic's response was quick and predictable. They sent ambassadors to Africa with an ultimatum hand over Hannibal for trial or face the music. The reception they got in the council chamber showcased how much had changed since the last conflict. Where the old oligarchy might have weighed the pros and cons and sought a peaceful resolution, the new leadership welcomed confrontation almost with a sigh of relief. The charade of peace was over. The real battle was about to kick off. The declaration that followed made it clear what both sides had been aware of for a while. The first round hadn't really settled anything. It just laid the groundwork for the real test of strength. This time, there would be no business deals, no diplomatic loopholes, no half measures. One civilization would rise to the top, and the other would be wiped out. The stakes couldn't be higher, but Hannibal wasn't planning to fight the same defensive battle that had worked for his enemies before. While Roman generals were busy plotting their strategies, thinking he'd hunker down and wait for them to attack, Hannibal was already setting in motion one of the boldest plans in history. If they thought he'd stay on the defensive, he was ready to take the fight right to their doorstep. The preparations for what would become the march to Italy were nothing short of mind-blowing. Hannibal needed to gather an army of nearly 90,000 men from a mix of different peoples, each with their own languages and customs. Supply lines were set up for a secretive journey, even for most of the commanders involved. In a stunning twist, 37 African elephants were trained for mountain warfare in conditions they'd never faced before. When they left New Carthage in the spring, it marked the peak of 20 years of preparation and the start of a campaign that would test whether one brilliant mind could outsmart institutional power. Hannibal's army was packed with the best soldiers Carthage could muster, battle-hardened infantry, legendary Numidian cavalry, elephants that could smash through enemy lines, and officers who shared their leader's vision of total victory. The trek through Gaul turned into an epic tale of endurance and diplomacy as much as movement. Hannibal negotiated with countless tribal chiefs, fought battles against those who wouldn't budge, and kept his diverse army united through sheer charisma. Roman scouts were tracking his movements, but seemed completely clueless about the scale of what was happening. How could any general seriously think about crossing the Alps with elephants and heavy gear? The answer came in the autumn, when Numidian cavalry appeared in the Po Valley like omens of doom. The impossible had become real. Hannibal had led an army over mountains that strategists thought were unpassable. Sure, many elephants didn't make it due to altitude and cold, and his forces were cut down by half, but what remained was a hardened group of professional soldiers, led by a commander whose reputation for invincibility was spreading like wildfire through the terrified towns of northern Italy. The psychological impact of this feat was just as crucial as its strategic importance. The Republic had built its entire strategy on the belief that any serious threat would come by sea, where their naval power could keep it in check. The sight of enemy forces in the heart of Italy, having bypassed every defensive measure, shattered the sense of security that had settled in after 2 decades of success. More importantly, Hannibal's presence in Italy offered an alternative to the Pax Romana that had been imposed on the diverse peoples of the peninsula. His army included Gauls who had never accepted Roman rule, warriors who had felt the weight of Roman governance, and African soldiers representing a different Mediterranean model. The message was loud and clear. Roman dominance wasn't a given and could be challenged. The stage was set for a showdown that would not only determine the fate of two cities, but also shape the future of Western civilization. In the harbor city, the oligarchy braced for a struggle that would push their financial resources and political unity to the limit. Meanwhile, the Senate and the Republic prepared for a type of warfare they had never faced before, not a distant fight against foreign foes, but a battle for survival right in their own backyard. Winter was creeping into the Alps, but the fire of vengeance that had fueled the Barcid family for 20 years was about to erupt onto the world stage. The greatest military mind of the ancient era was ready to fulfill his childhood vow, while the republic that had conquered Italy was about to find out if citizen virtue could stand up to professional excellence. The second act of this grand drama was on the verge of unfolding. The snow was still melting in the Alpine passes when the Barcid commander launched his first strike against the Italian heartland at the Trebia River, which was swollen from winter floods. He showcased the kind of fieldcraft that would soon make his name synonymous with genius. The consul Sempronius Longus, eager for glory and confident in the superiority of citizen soldiers, led his legions right into a carefully set trap. By evening, 20,000 Romans lay dead in the muddy fields, while the Punic army made a dramatic entrance into Italy with a victory that sent shockwaves through every city from the Alps to Sicily. The psychological impact of Trebia was even more significant than its martial consequences. For generations, Romans had grown used to hearing about victories won by their eagles in distant lands. Now, enemy campfires flickered within sight of Latin hills, while refugees streamed south, sharing tales of African elephants and Iberian swordsmen who seemed to predict every move the legions made. The republic that once conquered the peninsula now found itself fighting for survival in territories it had thought were permanently pacified. The genius of the Carthaginian general lay not just in his tactical innovations, though they were remarkable, but in his deep understanding of the political foundations of Roman power. Unlike past enemies who confronted the Republic head-on, the Phoenician commander realized that Italy was not a single entity, but a complex federation, held together by mutual interests and carefully calculated rewards. If he could show that Roman protection was worthless and Roman vengeance avoidable, the entire system might unravel from within. The campaign that followed Trebia became a masterclass in psychological warfare as much as operational strategy. Instead of marching directly on Rome, the invader moved his forces through the rich farmlands of Etruria, systematically devastating lands belonging to Roman citizens while leaving allied communities untouched. The message was clear. Those who had supported Rome would suffer, while those willing to switch sides would find a generous new protector. At Lake Trasimene, shrouded in morning mists rising from the water, the Barcid leader set his most daring ambush yet. The consul Flaminius, thinking he was chasing a retreating enemy, led his entire army into a narrow pass where Punic forces lay hidden. The slaughter that followed was so complete that historians would struggle for centuries to explain how 15,000 legionaries could simply vanish in a single morning. Flaminius himself died in the fighting. His body never recovered from the carnage that stained the lake's waters red. 2 devastating defeats in as many seasons shattered the confident assumptions that had guided Roman strategy since the first Punic victory. The traditional method of meeting enemies in open combat, relying on superior discipline and equipment for decisive results, had proven utterly useless against a commander who seemed to anticipate every move before it was made. Panic gripped the capital as citizens realized that their supposedly invincible system had encountered something genuinely unprecedented. The appointment of Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator marked a major shift in Roman thinking. Fabius understood what many of his contemporaries refused to see. The invading force was a limited resource that could be worn down through attrition, even if it couldn't be defeated directly. The strategy that emerged, following the enemy at a distance, harassing his foragers, cutting off stragglers, but avoiding major engagements, earned Fabius the mocking nickname Cunctator, the delayer. But this approach also began the slow process of wearing down the Carthaginian expeditionary force. Fabius's strategy was politically brilliant, but emotionally tough for a people raised on tales of glorious conquests and decisive victories. Romans watched helplessly as their countryside burned while their troops shattered the destroyers like anxious wolves, never closing in for the kill. Allied communities began to waver in their loyalty, questioning whether a protector who could not protect was worthy of their support. The Republic's enemies throughout the Mediterranean took notice, calculating whether the moment had come to settle old scores. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian general faced the one challenge his genius couldn't overcome: time itself. His army remained undefeated, and his reputation for invincibility intact. But each passing month brought new problems that no amount of tactical skill could fix. Reinforcements from the harbor city arrived sporadically and in insufficient numbers, while recruitment among Italian allies progressed much slower than his grand strategy required. Most critically, the promised support from Philip of Macedon and other eastern rulers remained frustratingly theoretical. The breaking point came when Roman impatience with Fabian caution led to the appointment of new consuls who promised a return to the aggressive tactics that had built the Republic's empire. Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus took the field with the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 86,000 men, drawn from every corner of the Confederation. If the Punic commander wanted a decisive engagement, they were ready to give him one that would end his threat forever. The clash at Cannae became one of the most analyzed battles in history, showcasing how brilliant strategy can outsmart sheer numbers. The invader set up his troops in a way that seemed to invite the Romans in, all while hiding a deadly trap. As the legions charged into what looked like a weak point, heavy infantry and cavalry quickly surrounded them like a predator closing in on its prey. The devastation that followed was beyond anything anyone had seen in ancient warfare. In just one afternoon, 50,000 Romans lost their lives, including Consul Paulus, 80 senators, and hundreds of knights whose families had served Rome for generations. Those who managed to escape didn't just bring news of defeat. They carried a much heavier burden: the realization that Roman dominance was a fragile illusion, easily shattered by skilled foes. Cannae marked the peak of the Italian campaign, but also highlighted the deep-rooted issues facing the Barcid forces. That stunning victory over a consular army didn't solve the bigger problems plaguing his campaign, like not having enough reinforcements, limited naval support, and the slow decline of his diverse army due to losses and desertion. Most importantly, that victory didn't achieve its main goal: breaking apart the Roman Confederation. The months after Cannae tested both civilizations in ways that pure military might couldn't touch. Several key cities switched sides to the invader, including Capua, whose wealth and strategic location seemed to confirm the idea that Roman control could be toppled. But the heart of the Confederation held strong, bonded by connections that proved more durable than short-term calculations. The Latin allies especially remained loyal, realizing that their privileged place within the Roman system offered better prospects than uncertain treatment from a foreign conqueror. The resilience shown by the Romans in the face of disaster surprised their enemies. Instead of negotiating after Cannae, the Senate freed slaves to fill the ranks of their depleted legions, borrowed against future revenues to keep fighting, and flat out refused to ransom the captured soldiers. The message was crystal clear. Rome was going to keep battling, no matter the cost, and anyone who sided with the invader could expect no mercy. When the time for revenge finally came, the nature of the conflict began to shift as both sides adapted to new realities that they hadn't initially seen coming. The Carthaginian general found himself increasingly tied to defending allied cities that couldn't hold up against Roman siege tactics. His once mobile force slowly turned into a collection of scattered garrisons, each vulnerable to the kind of wear-and-tear warfare that Roman engineering was so good at. The genius who had crushed legions in open battle now found himself stuck in defensive operations that undermined his greatest strengths. The Roman response evolved in ways that would have huge implications for the Republic's future. Unable to defeat the invader head-on, they started targeting the wider Punic Empire that supported his operations. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Africanus, emerged as the mastermind behind this new strategy. He understood that winning in Italy meant also succeeding in Spain, Africa, and anywhere else Carthaginian power could be challenged. The Iberian campaign became the testing ground for Roman reforms, where they could learn and improve. Scipio brought in tactics directly from the Barcid playbook, while keeping the discipline that remained the legion's biggest strength. His victories at Bacula and Ilipa showed that Roman commanders could learn from their losses, adapting enemy strategies while holding on to their own strengths. The defection of Syphax and the Numidian cavalry, who had been such a powerhouse for Carthage, marked a major turning point that went beyond just military strategy. Scipio's diplomatic win stripped the invader of that mobile striking force that was crucial to his game plan, while also giving Roman forces some much-needed capabilities they hadn't had before. The psychological effect was huge. If even Carthage's oldest allies were jumping ship, what did that say about the future of the conflict? Back in Italy, the slow grind of attrition was doing what those big battles just couldn't achieve. The expeditionary force was still a threat, but it wasn't the terrifying army that had once crossed the Alps with dreams of wiping out Roman power. Recruitment among Italian allies had nearly dried up. Reinforcements from Africa were coming in irregularly and just weren't enough, and the Phoenician commander was finding himself more and more isolated in a countryside that was increasingly hostile, where every village could be hiding enemies. At the same time, the siege of Syracuse showed how much the Republic was growing in confidence and capability. The city's legendary defenses, boosted by Archimedes' genius, had been thought to be unbreakable by earlier generations. But the Romans, with their persistence, engineering skills, and sheer determination, eventually broke through. Even though the brilliant mathematician lost his life in the chaos that followed, the fall of Syracuse sent a strong message across the Mediterranean. No fortress could hold out against Roman siege tactics forever. Meanwhile, Hannibal Barca's march from Iberia was Carthage's last serious attempt to reinforce his brother and grab that Decisive victory, it had seemed so close after Cannae. The younger Barca had rebuilt Punic power in the peninsula after Scipio's victories, recruited a fresh army from local warrior tribes, and even tried to pull off that famous Alpine crossing again. For a brief moment, it looked like two Carthaginian armies might converge on Rome itself, making the grand strategy that inspired the original expedition a reality. But then came the disaster at the Meteris River, which crushed those hopes brutally. The consul Gaius Claudius Nero showed the kind of operational speed that the Romans had picked up from their enemies. He marched north to support his colleague, while leaving Hasdrubal completely in the dark about his movements. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was more like an execution. Hasdrubal's tired troops found themselves trapped between two Roman armies, with no way out. The aftermath of the Meteris effectively ended the Italian adventure for Carthage. Even though the great commander would stick around for a few more years, when his brother's severed head was tossed into his camp by Roman cavalry, the Carthaginian general reportedly realized what that meant for Carthage. His words were prophetic. Without reinforcements or any real hope for a decisive victory, the invasion force had turned into a dead end, draining resources without pushing Phoenician goals forward. Scipio's landing in Africa was the climax of Rome's strategic evolution throughout this long struggle. The young general, who had learned his trade battling Punic forces in Iberia, now brought the fight to the enemy's home turf, flipping the script on the geographic advantages that had helped the invader in Italy. The army that landed near Utica was a different beast altogether from the legions that had suffered at Trebia and Cannae battle-hardened, led by officers who understood the enemy's tactics and backed by allies whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of defeat and recovery. The call for the Barcid commander to return home to defend his territory was one of history's great ironies. The general who had spent 15 years trying to crush Rome now found himself summoned back to prevent the very capital he had aimed to destroy from facing the fate he had planned for the Republic. The evacuation of his remaining forces was done with the same skill that had marked all his operations. But it couldn't hide the harsh truth. The greatest military genius of the ancient world had failed to meet his goals. The stage was set for a final showdown that would decide not just the outcome of one conflict, but the future of Mediterranean civilization itself. At Zama, 2 generations of innovation would clash in a battle that would test whether individual brilliance could overcome institutional adaptation. The Punic strategist faced an enemy transformed by 20 years of struggle, while Scipio commanded forces that embodied everything the Republic had learned from its darkest days. The long conflict was nearing its climax, and with it, the fate of empires hung in the balance. The dust from Zama had barely settled when the true scale of Carthage's defeat hit home. Scipio's victory was total. The Barcid commander's once mighty elephants turned on their own. His cavalry scattered like leaves in the wind, and his seasoned veterans fell by the thousands. Hannibal managed to escape the chaos, but his legendary status lay in ruins on the African plains, along with the dreams of dominance that had fueled 2 generations of struggle. The negotiations that followed felt less like a diplomatic exchange and more like the funeral rites for an empire. The terms imposed by the victorious Republic aimed not just to end the fighting, but to make sure that North Africa could never again threaten the new order rising across the Mediterranean. Hannibal led the Phoenician delegation, facing conditions that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. The settlement's terms hit at the very core of Carthaginian power. Their once mighty navy, which had ruled the western seas, was reduced to a mere 10 ships, barely enough for coastal patrols. The elephant corps that had once terrorized Roman legions from Trebia to Cannae was disbanded forever. To make matters worse, any military action beyond Africa's borders now required permission from the Roman Senate. And the most crushing blow? An indemnity of 10,000 talents, payable over 50 years, would drain their treasury and keep them in a state of perpetual subordination. Yet even as they signed away their empire's independence, few could have predicted the incredible resilience that would define the coming decades. The Phoenician city, stripped of its military might and colonial holdings, found hidden reserves of commercial energy that seemed to grow rather than shrink under the weight of defeat, much like a river that finds new paths after a landslide. This transformation began almost immediately. With the massive costs of maintaining fleets and garrisons across 3 continents lifted, Carthaginian merchants redirected their capital into trade ventures. Surprisingly, the indemnity payments, while daunting, were met with a punctuality that left observers amazed. Silver flowed from revitalized African mines. Agricultural estates were reorganized for maximum efficiency, and new trading networks sprang up to replace those lost with their western territories. Hannibal himself became a symbol of this shift from warrior to administrator. The general who once posed a serious threat to the Republic now channeled his brilliance into civic reform, applying the same strategic thinking that had defined his military campaigns to the essential tasks of governance. Tax collection was streamlined. Public works were funded through innovative financial means, and infrastructure was rebuilt to be more efficient. The port facilities, once home to hundreds of warships, were repurposed for trade. Triremes and quadriremes, which had once been prepared for battle, now carried cargoes bound for Alexandria, Rhodes, and even Italy. The circular basins that had once stood for Carthaginian dominance transformed into hubs of commerce, echoing with the shouts of traders instead of the clash of bronze. Agriculture across the African territories saw a similar revival. The estates that once fed distant garrisons were reorganized to cater to Mediterranean markets hungry for exotic goods. Olive oil from the interior hills started competing with the finest Greek varieties, while African wine began gracing tables from Spain to Syria. Even the elephant breeding grounds shifted to more practical uses, with their former inhabitants replaced by cattle and horses destined for foreign buyers. The population, swollen with refugees from lost territories, but no longer drained by military conscription, threw itself into these new endeavors with a fervor that bordered on frenetic. Workshops that had once cranked out weapons and armor now produced luxury goods sought after all over the known world. Phoenician purple dye, a timeless symbol of maritime wealth, commanded higher prices than ever as demand soared in an increasingly prosperous Mediterranean economy. This financial comeback was even more impressive given the watchful eyes of wary neighbors. The Berber kingdoms that shared borders with Tyrian territory had come out of the recent conflict as allies of the victorious Republic, with their cavalry playing a key role in the decisive battle at Zama. King Massinissa, in particular, was granted land that brought his kingdom right up to the gates of Carthage, creating a constant threat that Carthaginian diplomats had to handle with extreme caution. The relationship with these rulers became a source of ongoing tension that would ultimately threaten Carthage's independence. The Numidian king, boosted by his alliance with Rome and feeling confident in his military strength, started a systematic campaign to expand his territory, nibbling away at Carthaginian lands like a relentless tide wearing down a shoreline. Border raids turned into permanent occupations, while Carthaginian protests to the Roman authorities in far-off Italy were met with responses that ranged from indifferent to outright hostile. The core issue lay in the peace treaty's intentionally vague language about territorial boundaries. Earlier agreements had laid out clear geographic limits, but the post-Zama terms relied on ambiguous wording that could be twisted to favor the stronger party. When Numidian cavalry moved into fertile lands that had fed the city for generations, Carthaginian pleas for justice got tangled up in legal red tape that favored the accusers rather than the victims. Even worse was the psychological warfare that came with these territorial advances. The Numidian king's agents spread rumors throughout the Mediterranean that Carthage's prosperity was just a cover for plans to launch another military campaign. Every successful business venture was painted as proof of hidden military ambitions, while timely payments of indemnities were twisted into evidence that secret treasures were available for future warfare. Rome's reaction to these accusations showed just how suspicious they were of their former enemies. Despite clear evidence that Carthage was meeting its obligations, influential senators began to question whether such a quick recovery was truly compatible with genuine submission. The very success of Carthage's revival became a reason for renewed hostility, as if prosperity itself was a form of rebellion against the new order. Marcus Porcius Cato stood out as the most vocal advocate of this increasingly paranoid view. This elder statesman, whose political career was built on promoting traditional Roman values and distrust of foreign influence, found in Carthage's resurgence the perfect target for his rhetoric. His visits to Africa, which were supposed to be diplomatic missions aimed at settling border disputes, turned into intelligence-gathering trips that fed his growing belief that the peace was just a pause before the next war. Cato's famous slogan, "Carthago delenda, est Carthage must be destroyed," became more than just a political catchphrase. It turned into an obsession that influenced every part of his public life. In speech after speech, he painted vivid images of Carthaginian merchants hoarding wealth for military purposes, of port facilities that could quickly be converted into naval bases, and of a population that had merely traded military service for financial cunning while keeping its deep-seated hostility toward Rome's new order. Few missed the irony that the very traits Rome had once prided itself on, enterprise, civic virtue, and resilience in tough times, were now used as evidence of Carthaginian treachery. The city that had rebuilt itself through peaceful means, that had met every obligation with meticulous care, and that had transformed itself from a military threat into a model of commercial success, found its achievements turned against it by enemies who preferred their former foes weak rather than thriving. Carthaginian attempts to defend themselves through diplomatic channels only fueled Roman suspicions about their true intentions. When ambassadors protested Numidian encroachments with well-crafted legal arguments, their very eloquence was seen as a sign of dangerous sophistication. When they offered extra tribute beyond what was required as a gesture of goodwill, it was interpreted as a ploy to buy time for sinister plans. No action, no matter how innocent, could escape being viewed through the lens of predetermined hostility. Hannibal's presence became a real source of worry for those who saw Carthage's comeback as a threat. The general who once pushed Rome to the edge of ruin was now the chief magistrate, using his incredible organizational skills for civilian administration. His reforms were obviously beneficial. Tax collection got way more efficient. Public works projects gave jobs to thousands, and trade relationships were made to benefit everyone involved. But believe it or not, his competence made some folks uneasy, especially those who preferred their enemies to be clueless. Eventually, the pressure got too much, even for someone as tough as Hannibal. When demands for his extradition popped up something that would definitely lead to his execution, the legendary commander opted for exile instead of surrender. He slipped away from the city that had been his life's work, seeking refuge with Eastern rulers. His departure was meant to ease tensions, but it only cranked up Roman suspicions about what other secrets Carthage might be hiding. The final crisis came from something as simple as a dispute over grazing rights in lands that had been contested for ages. Numidian herders, backed by Roman forces, took over lands that Carthaginian farmers claimed by ancestral right. When local magistrates tried to sort things out using traditional legal methods, they found themselves facing armed groups that seemed more interested in stirring up trouble than finding a solution. The Carthaginian response showed just how deeply the effects of their defeat had sunk in. Instead of rallying troops to kick out the intruders, something that would have been standard practice in earlier times, the government turned to Roman arbitrators for justice. Delegation after delegation crossed the sea to plead their case to senators who had already decided that any complaint from Carthage was proof of aggressive intentions. The final embassy, led by older diplomats who remembered the Great Wars and understood what was at stake, made one last effort to keep the peace through reason and legal arguments. The welcome they received in the Senate House was polite but chilly. Their arguments were heard with the kind of attention usually given to representatives of a subordinate power. When the verdict finally came down, it felt like a divine decree. Carthage had violated the spirit, if not the letter, of its obligations, and must face whatever consequences the offended parties deemed fit. The return of these envoys to Africa marked the end of an era that had begun with so much promise. Just 50 years earlier, the city had turned defeat into prosperity, honored every obligation, and shown its commitment to coexistence. Now it found itself condemned by the very success it had achieved. The peaceful times were fading, and with them, the last hope that two civilizations could share the Mediterranean without one trying to destroy the other. As word of the Senate's decision spread through the bustling streets of Carthage, citizens who had only known the calm prosperity of recent years started to realize the scale of the crisis ahead. The workshops that once produced luxury items would soon be churning out military gear. The merchant ships that had carried goods would be converted for war, and the generation that had grown up in a world of trade was about to face the brutal realities of total conflict. The change was as quick as it was desperate. Hidden stockpiles of weapons were unearthed from secret spots. Veteran officers, who had fought in distant lands, returned to lend their expertise, and the civilian population braced itself for a siege that everyone knew would be about survival, not conquest. The uneasy peace was over, and the final act of this grand drama was about to unfold. The declaration that swept across the Mediterranean that spring felt like a storm brewing. After years of rising tensions and made-up grievances, the Italian Republic finally found its excuse to do what Cato had been demanding for ages. The message sent to the North African capital was short and harsh: either completely disarm and move the entire population 10 miles inland, or face the Senate's wrath. The terms of this ultimatum were impossible to accept. No civilization could survive without its port facilities, the lifeblood that had kept the Phoenician city thriving for 7 centuries. This demand wasn't just about submission. It was a push towards collective suicide, a clear provocation that paved the way for the total destruction that Rome truly wanted. The senators who came up with these conditions knew full well that no one would willingly agree to such terms. In the very council chambers where Hannibal once plotted his march to Italy, seasoned magistrates now faced a choice that would change everything. They had two stark options: accept death through compliance, or choose annihilation through resistance. There was no middle ground, no diplomatic escape from the trap that had closed in on them for 50 years. The bitter peace was ending, just as its creators had planned. The debate that followed showed how much had changed since the days of imperial glory. The merchant princes who once calculated profits and losses with cold detachment were gone, replaced by men who realized that honor might matter more than survival. Those who stood up to speak didn't talk about business gains or land grabs. They spoke about the duty owed to ancestors who had built this civilization from a handful of refugees fleeing persecution. When the vote came, it was unanimous. A Tyrian colony refused to abandon the very ground where Dido had first set foot, refused to give up the harbors shaped by generations of engineers, and refused to surrender the temples where their gods had been worshipped for as long as anyone could remember. If destruction was inevitable, they would face it standing firm in their ancestral home, not wandering like beggars in foreign lands. The preparations that followed were frantic yet efficient. Hidden arsenals revealed weapons that had been secretly kept despite treaties, while workshops shifted from peaceful production to war gear. The population, now swollen with refugees from nearby areas, threw itself into defense preparations with the fierce energy of people who knew they were fighting for more than just survival. They were protecting the last remnant of a world that would vanish forever if they failed. The harbor that once welcomed merchant ships from all over the Mediterranean was now lined with makeshift fortifications. The circular naval base, once a proud symbol of maritime power, was blocked with chains and floating barriers to fend off any amphibious attacks. Every street had turned into a potential battleground, every building transformed into a fortress, and every citizen became a soldier in what everyone knew would be the final showdown. The consular armies crossing from Sicily that summer were the result of generations of Roman military evolution. These weren't the same legions that had faced Hannibal, learning tough lessons through bitter defeats. Instead, they represented the mature strength of a republic that had conquered the known world. Their gear was standardized, their discipline was top-notch, and their confidence was sky-high. Marcus Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus led forces that were larger than anything ever sent against. African targets 80,000 infantry, backed by cavalry, engineers, and the most advanced siege equipment of the time. They set up camp around the doomed city like harbingers of doom. The blockade that followed was total, cutting off not just military supplies, but also the food that kept the defenders alive. But the early months of the siege showed that sheer numbers couldn't easily break through the stronghold defended by desperate people. The massive walls surrounding the city had been reinforced with every engineering trick learned over 7 centuries. Behind those walls, a population that had embraced martyrdom fought with a fierceness that surprised the attackers, who were used to enemies seeking reasonable terms once defeat was clear. The first assaults were met with losses that shocked the besiegers. Defenders who had never seen combat before showed incredible bravery when fighting for their homes and families. Women and children worked alongside men to fix breaches, while craftsmen who had spent their lives creating beautiful things now turned their skills to making weapons. What should have been a quick siege dragged on for months as the attackers realized they faced an enemy that preferred death over surrender. The failure of direct assaults led to a change in command that would shift the tide of the conflict. Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of the victor of Zama, took charge of operations that had stalled despite overwhelming numbers. The younger Scipio didn't just bring fresh troops. He introduced a systematic approach to siege warfare that left nothing to chance. Under his leadership, the blockade became a masterclass in military engineering. A double wall, stretching for miles around the city, sealed off every escape route. The harbor mouth was blocked by a massive stone mole that took months to build, making naval relief impossible. Most importantly, the siege lines expanded to cover the entire metropolitan area, trapping not just the defenders, but every civilian who had sought refuge within the walls. The defenders' response to this careful strangulation showed both their cleverness and desperation. In secret, they carved a new channel through the harbor's southern wall, creating an outlet that bypassed the stone barrier. From hidden shipyards, a makeshift fleet emerged to challenge the blockade ships, made from temple furnishings and private homes that had been taken apart for materials. This last naval effort captured everything the Phoenician tradition stood for: innovation born of necessity, courage against impossible odds, and seamanship passed down through generations. For a brief moment, it looked like the ancient mastery of the waters might save the city that had birthed it. But the attempt came too late and with too few resources to change the balance of power. The destruction of this makeshift fleet marked the end of organized resistance outside the walls. With their last link to the outside world severed, the defenders faced the harsh truth that their struggle had turned into a prolonged act of collective martyrdom. Food supplies dwindled to nothing. Disease started claiming victims faster than the Roman rams battering the outer walls. Starvation gnawed at the defenders' will, while dysentery and fever spread through the crowded tenements where refugees huddled with soldiers. Yet, even as their bodies weakened, the spirit of resistance burned brightly in the hearts of Carthage's people. The city, built by exiles and sustained by centuries of defiance, refused to give in quietly. Every rooftop became a lookout for archers, every alley a spot for ambushes. Women wove slings from scraps of cloth to hurl stones at the approaching Roman soldiers, while children carried water to cool the makeshift forges that turned household items into weapons. The priests of Tanit and Baal-Hamon, their altars stained with the ashes of desperate offerings, lead processions through the streets, calling for divine protection for a cause that seemed increasingly lost. Scipio Aemilianus, watching the city's fierce resistance, realized that time was now his best friend. The double wall surrounding Carthage, a true feat of Roman engineering, made sure no supplies could get in, while his fleet patrolled the coast, shutting down any attempts at help from the sea. His strategy was simple but relentless: starve the defenders, wear them down, and wait for them to break. But he also got that Carthage meant more than just a city. This was the climax of a century-long struggle between two different visions of civilization. To finish it off decisively, he needed not just a win, but a spectacle that would send a clear message across the Mediterranean to anyone thinking of challenging Rome's power. By the spring of 146 BC, the city's defenses were starting to crumble under the constant pressure. The outer walls, battered and breaking from months of bombardment, could no longer hold up against the Roman siege engines. Scipio called for a focused attack on Baetia Hill, the fortified center of Carthage, where the last defenders had retreated. The assault was brutal and unyielding. Roman legions, battle-hardened from years of fighting, pushed through streets littered with debris and bodies, facing fierce resistance at every corner. The Carthaginians fought with the desperation of those who had everything to lose, using whatever they could find: swords, stones, even broken pottery to hold back the tide. The narrow streets of the old city, built for trade and community, turned into a deadly maze, where Roman discipline met Punic determination. The final battle for Byrsa was a snapshot of the war itself. The citadel, topped by the ancient temple of Eshwan, stood as the last stronghold of Carthaginian identity. Here, the city's leaders, alongside soldiers and civilians, made their last stand. The commander Hasdrubal, not the famous Barcid hero, but a lesser figure thrust into leadership by circumstance, rallied the defenders with promises of divine help. His wife, whose name is lost to history, but remembered in Roman accounts for her bravery, stood by him until the end. As the Romans broke through the citadel's gates, she supposedly cursed her husband for even thinking about surrender, choosing instead to throw herself and her children into the flames of the burning temple rather than face capture. The image of her silhouette against the fire would haunt Roman historians, a powerful symbol of a people pushed to the brink of extinction. The sack of Carthage lasted 6 days, a chaotic wave of destruction that spared no corner of the city. The Romans, furious from the prolonged resistance and driven by Scipio's iron grip, systematically looted and burned what was left. Temples were stripped of their riches, homes reduced to rubble, and the great harbors were filled with debris to make them unusable. The population, already weakened by starvation and disease, faced either enslavement or death. Ancient sources claim that around 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery, their fates scattered across the Roman world as laborers, gladiators, or concubines. The city's libraries, treasure troves of Phoenician knowledge, were either burned or scattered, with some texts allegedly handed over to Numidian allies. The Tophet, with its grim urns of sacrificial remains, was buried under rubble, left for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Scipio Aemilianus, standing in the midst of the smoldering ruins, is said to have wept not for Carthage, but for the fleeting nature of all human achievements. Quoting Homer, he reflected on the fall of Troy, seeing in Carthage's destruction a mirror of what could one day happen to Rome itself. This gesture was as much political as it was personal, a message to his troops and the Senate that victory should come with a dose of humility. Yet the reality of Carthage's end was harsh. The Senate ordered the site cursed, the ground sown with salt in a symbolic act to ensure it would never rise again. The fields that had once fed the city were handed over to Roman allies, and the harbors that had given birth to an empire were left to fill with silt. Carthage, the jewel of the western Mediterranean, was wiped off the map. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC was more than just the end of a city. It was the complete wipeout of a civilization that had shaped the Mediterranean for 7 centuries. The Phoenician Empire, which began with a clever fugitive princess and thrived thanks to its savvy sailors, was gone. Rome absorbed its colonies, redirected its trade routes to fuel its own ambitions, and left its gods sidelined, overshadowed by Jupiter and Mars. But Carthage's legacy stuck around in ways that neither the victors nor the vanquished could have imagined. Woven into the very fabric of the world, Rome would create on its ashes. Right after the fall, Rome cashed in on its victory. The treasure taken from Carthage funded stunning new temples, aqueducts, and public works that transformed the Republic into a bustling imperial capital. North Africa's farms became Rome's breadbasket, feeding a growing population and supporting legions that would go on to conquer Greece, Egypt, and beyond. The Numidian king Massinissa, whose cavalry played a key role in the battle at Zama, and whose actions sparked the final war, got a unified kingdom that stretched across the Maghreb. But let's be real, Rome's victory came with a hefty price tag. Losing its biggest rival meant the Republic had no one to keep its ambitions in check, which eventually led to the internal strife that tore it apart. The paranoia that drove Cato's crusade against Carthage turned inward as senators began to turn on each other in a frantic grab for power. Carthage's influence didn't just vanish. It lingered in more subtle ways. Roman admirals studied and adapted Carthage's naval innovations, like ship designs, harbor engineering, and navigation techniques, helping Rome dominate the seas during the Pax Romana. The mixed arms warfare perfected by Hannibal became a blueprint for Roman generals like Scipio Africanus, whose successors would refine it into the flexible tactics we associate with the Roman legions. And let's not forget Carthage's commercial savvy. The trade networks that once made the Phoenician city rich were repurposed to fuel Rome's economy, with African ports like Utica and Hippo Regius becoming vital hubs in a Mediterranean now unified under Roman law. But the memory of Carthage was shaped just as much by propaganda as by actual history. Roman writers like Polybius and Livy painted the city as a cautionary tale of pride and betrayal, with its destruction seen as a divine thumbs up for Rome's destiny. Stories about child sacrifice in the Tophet were likely exaggerated to make a point, turning into a staple of Roman rhetoric that justified wiping the city off the map as a moral necessity. Yet beneath all that, there was a grudging respect for the enemy that had pushed Rome to its limits. Hannibal, in particular, became a figure of fascination, with his campaigns studied by Roman generals, and his name evoking both fear and admiration. Fast forward a few centuries, and when Rome itself began to wobble, the ghost of Carthage haunted its decline. The site of the city, once cursed and abandoned, was eventually resettled under Julius Caesar and Augustus as a Roman colony, with its harbors rebuilt and fields reclaimed. But this new Carthage was just a shadow of the old one, more of a provincial outpost than a powerhouse. The Phoenician language faded away, replaced by Latin and later Greek, and the gods Tanit and Baal-Hamon were either forgotten or mixed into Roman worship. Still, archaeological remnants lingered, pottery, inscriptions, and the outlines of grand harbors testifying to a civilization that once stood toe-to-toe with Rome. In modern times, scholars and romantics rediscovered Carthage's story, digging up its ruins to reveal a city of remarkable sophistication. The Tophet, filled with thousands of urns, sparked debates about Punic religion, while the partially restored harbors showcased engineering skills that rivaled Rome's. Hannibal's campaigns became a gold standard for military historians, with his daring crossing of the Alps and genius at Cannae studied alongside legends like Alexander and Napoleon. Even though Carthage itself was physically erased, it became a symbol of resilience and defiance, a reminder that even the mightiest empires aren't invincible. The fall of Carthage marked the end of one chapter in Mediterranean history and kicked off another. Rome, free from challengers in the West, went on to build an empire spanning 3 continents, with roads and laws that would shape the world for centuries. But the cost of that triumph was a loss of balance, a shift from republic to empire that carried the seeds of its own downfall. Carthage, the city that dared to take on the eagles, left behind a legacy of endurance, a testament to our ability to create, resist, and adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Mediterranean world turned toward a Roman future, The ashes of Carthage whispered a warning. No empire, no matter how mighty, lasts forever.